I think we have one more person in the waiting room.
David is not yet here, yeah?
Not yet here. So as the chair, I'll make a tentative suggestion momentarily. So, well, welcome everyone to the panel entitled Combating Anti-Soviet Resistance in Late Stalinist USSR, Moscow's Novel Strategies to Address Post-War Threats. My name is Nicholas Ganson from Hellenic College in Brookline, Massachusetts, and I'm honored to be chairing the panel. Our panelists are Igor Casu, who is the director of the Center for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes in the Cold War, on the Faculty of History and Philosophy at the State University of Moldova. We have Violeta Davoliute, who's professor at the Institute of Political Science and International Relations at Vilnius University, as well as senior researcher at the Lithuania Institute of History. And we have Alexandra Sukalo, who's an advanced PhD student at Stanford University. And as I understand, she expects to defend and complete later this academic year. So we wish her success and good fortune. We also have, last but not least, our distinguished discussant, David Shearer, who has not entered the room yet, but hopefully will be joining us shortly. He is Thomas Munsey Keith Professor of History at the University of Delaware. Okay, so any mistakes in the introductions, or is that all more or less accurate? Is that good? Okay, so in the event that David is not able to join us, what I think would be a good idea is if all of the participants in the panel, just listen closely to the presentations, and then we can have a discussion based on our questions and our thoughts, in addition to anything that the audience has for us. So we have some time devoted to the discussant, 10 minutes, and we have some additional time, about 15 minutes, for Q&A. So we'll just roll panelist Q&A into the more general discussion in the event that David does not join us. Okay, so without further delay, we'll ask Igor to get us started, and he'll be followed by Violeta and then Alexandra. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nicholas. Let me say that this paper is a part of the book project on post-war famine in Moldavian USSR in Soviet and European context. And I elaborated this paper during my New Europe College Fellowship in Bucharest last year. Hunger rights are among the most visible forms of protest resulting from deprivation and severe food shortages. In every regime, food rights are at the heart of the polity's existence. This paper is about how the Soviet government dealt with hunger rights in post-war Moldavia in the spring of 1946, just in the threshold of the World Union famine of 46-47. All in all, about 30 riots were registered in spring, early summer 1946, especially in the southern and central Bessarabian districts. In about 2/3 of them, women dominated numerically, thus the food riots can be conceptualized as women's riots, or babi bunte, as Lynn Viola called them for the 30s. I will argue that the specificity of food riots as they occurred in Soviet Moldavia is related to the pre-Soviet history of the region and pertains to its political culture and the ethos of protest. I will also argue that the official discourse on food disturbances varied from one institution or official to another. Although on occasion party and militia accounts on riots did acknowledge them as legitimate or quasi-legitimate and interpreted them as a weapon of the weak, the view of the security organs prevailed. The latest perception was that class enemies were behind the protesters, and in addition, there were national dimensions embedded in the rallies. Subsequently, the regime read the protest and their open, defiant character as proof of the resistance to the Soviet power that justified, in turn, harsh measures against those who organized and supported it. The deterioration of the food supply situation, mainly concerning bread shortages, has been recorded as early as mid-summer 1945. It was not, however, limited to Moldavian USSR. A similar phenomenon is recorded in other republics as well, mainly in southeastern Ukraine and Russia. only in the Moldavian USSR, more precisely in its Bessarabian part, the food shortages dissatisfaction would take the form of the widespread open protests. In contradistinction to the previous and later phenomenon, the spring ones were mainly peaceful. The initiators and participants behaved in a very particular way. They were non-violent, or more precisely employed violence only in a limited way, excluding physical injuries and aiming at getting access to the grain stores in broad daylight. This is very important, in broad daylight, in a kind of public performance setting. It was a form of open protest and at the same time an act of sedition in that it exhibited a peculiar culture of opposition to the authorities. As if the protesters were saying, we know that what we are doing is not legal, but it is not illegal at the same time, and we do not hide our discontent and act openly in a fair manner, in contrast to the criminals who steal during the night, using weapons and violence against the authorities. The reports do not converge on the same plot as a whole and sometimes are utterly divergent as to the causation, the distribution of blame, and the significance of these food riots. The first food riot occurred in February 46, in late February, and unlike most to follow, would be dominated by men. Almost 200 peasants attacked the grain storehouse in north of Bessarabia, and a report of the state security stated that the storehouse's devastation failed on that day due to the authorities' expedient measures. On the next day, 6 women repeated the attempt. They were apprehended by warders and local activists while breaking the locks and entering the storehouse. Shortly after, the NGB group arrived on the spot and arrested 2 men thought to be the real instigators. At this stage, the authorities tended to view women as lacking agency and not capable of acting independently. Hence, the causes and initiators were to be looked for elsewhere. Other assaults on the local granaries followed in April and reached its peak in May. On April 17, about 45 women attacked in the daylight a grain storehouse in Chimișlia district in the south, unappropriated grain. The reason for such drastic action was the refusal of the storehouse's managers to allot them 1 pud, that is 16 kilograms of wheat each. Most of the participants in these food riots were women with children in tow and teenagers. The husbands were still serving in the Red Army. In this food riot actually gave a real headache to the authorities because it was spontaneous. There were no instigators other than the participants. And as I said, the later were women of the Red Army recruits, that is representing the social basis of the Soviet regime in countryside. When hunger riots multiplied in the next month, the approach toward women changed. In fact, it did already in late April. In one of that, Kirsova, in April 24, resulted in arrest of 3 women identified as real culprits. In another riot, the next day, in the same area, Southern, in Bucharest, by arresting 2 women, the authorities made clear again that punishment cannot be ruled out for them as well. In the peasant rebellions of 1930, Lin Viola established that the woman, a quotation, like an unruly child or a butting goat, she was not held responsible for her actions, even in cases when she was subject to reprimand and punishment. End of quotation. This observation might be valid for 46 food riots in Soviet Moldavia, but the information in our case is scant. Additional research on how Soviet officials' perceptions on women changed after the Second World War relative to the 30s is needed to answer this question. Large number of participants in the food riots made the authorities suspecting the protest had an organized character. Indeed, it is hardly a coincidence that 50, 60, 100 or several hundred persons met just occasionally on a specific date in a particular place. In many cases, the preparation for the manifestations started days or weeks before. In reality, there was no movement organization behind them, and this they represented an authentic grassroots phenomenon, I would say. Another interesting aspect pertains to the interaction and roles played by women and men in these food riots. At least in one case, in late April, women acted in the front line while men stayed in the back, ready to intervene in case of danger. This scene resembles many registered in 1930 during the March fever in the old Soviet territories analyzed by Lynn Viola. Possibly the same pattern of action occurred in other hunger riots, but the information on about half of them is rather scarce, and it is difficult to say with certainty. Mikhail Sholokhov did refer in his famous novel, The Virgin Land, to such a peasant resistance model in the North Caucasus in the early 1930s. Most of the hunger riots, either dominated by women or not, took place in villages with a Romanian majority. In some of them, Gagauz represented the majority, and in one community, the population was mixed, about 50-50 Gagauz Bulgarian, in Kirsova, now in Comrat, in Uta Gagauzia. Ethnic Romanians were subject to all union mobilization in the Red Army, about 300,000 participating on various fronts between May 1944 and May 1945, even later in the war against Japan. By early 46, many did not return home, and yet fell on the front line. It is important to know that the Gagauz and Bulgarians were subject to only to selective recruitment due to their categorization as diaspora ethnic groups. That is quasi-enemy nations because their homelands fought on the side of Nazi Germany. That is purportedly Turkey for Gagauz and Bulgaria for Bulgarians. In Dezginja, a Gagauz village near my home village, by spring 1946, for instance, only 18 men were conscripted in a village of 1,200 households. It is safe to admit thus that women acted independently without a husband at home to rely upon were higher in the Gagauz than in the Romanian villages. It was not by accident that women dominated among those attacking state grain stockpiles. But although women dominated most of the food riots, as Viola noticed on the 1930 March fever, women's rights were part of the peasant culture of revolt and moral peasant economy writ large. Traditionally, women were in charge of feeding their family, and their maternal instinct prompted them to act whatever it takes to deliver food. They would sacrifice food for their children during the incoming famine in the winter and spring 1947. Evidence from the Great Irish Famine suggests that women were much more active in defending their families and securing the minimum food reserves. In general, women would also prove more resilient and resistant to food shortages. This was depicted for Moldova, for instance, by Ion Druța, the most celebrated Soviet Moldavian writer, in his autobiographical novel, The Burden of Our Goodness, published in '69. What triggered the riots beside the food crisis as such? And I'm finishing now and getting to conclusions. In several cases, the reports on the food riots mention war rumors. Some of the participants of the riots thought that there would be a war very soon, either the USA or Great Britain declaring war on the Soviet Union. The rumors of the possible war with the West were fueled by the official press, Soviet press as well. For instance, when publishing Churchill's speech of March 5th, 1946, Massachusetts, Nicholas, near your place, Fulton. The hunger riots of spring '46 in Soviet Moldavia then occurred in a different context to spring 1930. It pertained to the uncertainties of the beginning of the Cold War and hopes of large swaths of population of Bessarabia to become again part of Romania. Hence, the food riots in Soviet Moldavia had not only a pronounced gender, but also a national ethnic component. And some conclusions. Although the subsistence crisis and the subsequent famine were an all-Union problem in 44, 47, I would say, the causes and responses differed regionally. The hunger riots in Soviet Moldavia in spring 46 thus represent a particular pattern of societal response in the famine's wake, a weapon of the weak, as James Scott, to use James Scott paradigm. Similar disturbances were registered across the Soviet Union in late 20s and 1930s in the context of the all-out collectivization analyzed in detail and conceptualized by Lin Viola as Much Fever or Babi Bund. After the Second World War, however, the pattern of open protest accompanied by seizing grain in a ritualized form of public performance, quasi-peaceful and non-violent, is specific only to the Bessarabian district of the Moldavian SSR. By 1946, the Bessarabian population still shared the protest culture practiced in inter-war Romania and Tsarist Russia. According to this moral understanding of society, economy, and politics, protesting for subsistence was legitimate. When peaceful means were exhausted, peasants resorted to other forms of protest, covert and violent. And I'm finishing several sentences more. The food riots in spring 46, Soviet Moldavia, thus have relevance to the broader discussion on resistance in the post-war Soviet Union as a whole. In contrast to the Baltic republics and Western Ukraine, where resistance was initially widespread and violent, the pattern in Soviet Moldavia is different. Only after the Soviets failed to satisfy the legitimate request for bread did the violent forms of resistance occur, beginning in the summer and fall 1946. In turn, more societal violence gave an excuse to the authorities to embark on more repressions against a community striving to make ends meet. The peasant protest evolved later into more violent and brutal forms that subsequently served the regime's rationalization of peasant dissent as class war, with all consequences to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Igor. Very, very interesting. We look forward to the comments and questions. So next we have Violeta. Do you want me to read the title? I think I neglected to read the title of Igor.
Just give me a second. I will put my slides so it will be easier for people to follow. Okay, just 1 second.
Sure.
Sorry, guys.
So Violeta, I think if you're trying to start the slideshow, if you go to the top toolbar, moving from left to right, it says Home, Insert, Draw, Design, Transitions, Animation, Slideshow. So if you click on Slideshow and then Start, that should take you to the title slide.
Okay, hold on. Just 1 second, please.
Sure.
How can this not be visible? Just give me a second, please. It's not be visible. I don't get it. Slideshow. No idea.
Are you trying to start it, Violeta?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, can you hear me?
so yeah, so if you go to the center top of the screen, approximately the center,
Yeah,
the top,
center
there's
top
a slideshow.
I see.
A little bit to the left, So
look to the left.
we're animation to the right of animations. You have slideshow. If you click on that.
Slideshow to the right of animations. Hold on.
Right.
Oh.
So it's between animations and review at the top, where it says slideshow. So a little bit to the right, just a bit. Yeah, there we go. And then you hit play from start. That should get you going. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, and we see the title slide right now, so it's perfect.
Violeta, you're muted again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Resistance and Sovietization of the Western borderlands in the mirror of the cinema of late Stalinism. Hold on. Okay. So, yeah, so you guys see my overview as well, right?
Yes.
Is now everything okay? Okay, sorry.
Everything looks great. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Okay. So the Soviet strategy for regaining authority in the Baltic states after World War II was novel only insofar as it adapted the traditional tools of Sovietization developed in the wake of the Russian Revolution and Civil War to a new context. Along with collectivization and industrialization, kinofikatia or cinemification was seen as a means of spreading Soviet ideology through modernity. The Soviets famously valued cinema as the most important art for its unparalleled power in mobilizing political consciousness. Kinofikatia was part of the revolutionary toolkit. Continuity between post-war practices and the fateful period of Soviet rule from 1940 to 1941 is relevant. The key institutions of Soviet cultural policy, like the professional unions for writers and artists, were established at that time, along with the nationalization of all media and publishing houses. In this regard, the German occupation from 1941 to 1944 in the Baltics did not interrupt, but rather reinforced the trend towards state control of cultural life, along with the elimination of most interwar cultural elites through genocide and mass population displacement. So in this presentation, I'll try to examine the simultaneous release in 1947 of 3 feature films, one in each of the Baltic states. Taken together, they form a case study for how the Soviets went about integrating the newly annexed Western territories into the USSR via this cinemification process. After a brief discussion of political and social context, I will briefly analyze the 3 films. Live in the Citadel, made in Estonia and directed by Herbert Rappaport. Marite, in Lithuania, directed by Vera Strojeva. And Victoria's Return, made in Latvia and directed by Alexander Ivanov. So my basic argument is that the process of making these films was as important as the product. Each film retold the story of World War II in a way that integrates national experience with Soviet victory. This narrative strategy was embodied in a social and political strategy of mobilizing society in support of post-war reconstruction, with youth and creative elites fashioned as agents of modernization. To make these films, famous directors from Moscow and Leningrad worked together with dozens of local actors, writers, cameramen, musicians, and composers that came from the Baltics and were active during the interwar era. Or were just newly recruited. This helped to draw the local elites into new patron-client relationships centered on the production of a hybrid Soviet culture. And so just briefly about the post-war context. The political situation in the Baltic states in the immediate post-war years was precarious. The anti-Soviet resistance was armed and active, fighting against Soviet power that was extending its authority from the elites to the countryside. And against this background, the battle for hearts and minds was key. All over the Baltics, young people, especially young people, were targeted as potential supporters for Soviet agenda and recruited into various cultural organizations, young writers clubs, to write for local newspapers, and so forth. The anti-Soviet opposition also targeted young people as potential supporters of the underground press, to write poetry, to spread the word in the villages, and so forth. And cinema was really at the heart of this, and the screenings of propaganda films, especially in the provincial areas in the Baltics, were perceived by the anti-Soviet resistance as an aggressive attempt in indoctrination. And so some research has been done, and it has been established that in the countryside, there were many more propaganda films or attempts to show propaganda films in comparison with the urban centers where one could see, trophy films and so forth. So not surprisingly, on more than one occasion, anti-Soviet partisans tried to disrupt the screenings. According to Elena Zubkova, the post-war period of Stalinist Sovietization can be divided into two periods. The first period after 1947 was marked by relative liberalism as an inclusive effort to recruit the local elites to support the Soviet project. And the turning point came in 1947 with the approval of plans for operations Vesna and Priboi, the mass deportations that would see hundreds of thousands of people deported from the Baltic states in 1948 and 1949. And so collectivization and the suppression of active resistance were by and large complete by the end of 1949. So this is a bit of a context when these films are released. Now briefly on the aims of cinematification. The decision to produce a feature film for each Baltic state, Soviet Baltic state, immediately after the war was taken centrally in Moscow and transmitted through government directives approved by the Communist Party in each republic in the spring of 1946. The intent was to release the films in time for the 30th anniversary of the October Revolution in the fall of 1947. The centralized nature of this decision and the coordination of timing suggests a conscious policy and clear intention on the part of the authorities in Moscow. Notably, this came at a time when the film industry was extremely short of funds. Only 22 films were made that crossed the entire USSR in 1947, and that 3 of these were made in the Baltics, signaled an exceptional degree of attention to this region. But what exactly was the intention? How are we to contextualize the simultaneous production of these cinematic works in each of the 3 Baltic republics? Beneath the surface of these questions lies a deeper debate over the character of culture under Soviet rule. This debate goes to the heart of how Soviet culture and propaganda sought not only to persuade, but to transform the population to create Soviet subjects. So I will get back to these questions in the conclusions, but now I will provide a short analysis of the narrative strategies employed in each film. The Estonian film Life in a Citadel is basically a narrative of Soviet victory against Germans told through the prism of family melodrama. The action of the film takes place in the fall sorry, I forgot to move my slides. I'll just keep this and go to the first one, Life in Citadel. So it takes place in the fall of 1944 as the German forces retreat before the Soviet advance. And the film is based on a play by August Jakobsen, an Estonian writer and first chairman of the Soviet Writers' Union, Estonian Soviet Writers' Union, and a high communist official in post-war structures. Lives in the Citadel was made into a movie script by Leonid Trauberg, a Soviet Ukrainian writer and film director. And the film was directed by Herbert Rappaport, the famous Soviet director born in Vienna. For those who are not familiar with Rappaport's biography, I'll just quickly remind that Rappaport emigrated to the USA after Hitler came to power, and then worked in Hollywood, and from there was recruited by the Soviets in 1936 to help internationalize and modernize the Soviet film industry. So in 1938, Rappaport directed a movie called Professor Mamlok, called by some the first film on the Holocaust. And this film is also centered on a portrait of a famous medical doctor, a Jewish doctor, who is disturbed by his son's communist sympathies. So in an interesting way, then this life in a citadel follows the same narrative plot. Once again, the generational conflict, the professor at the center trying to be neutral, to survive without choosing sides, to believe, and he believes in Estonian case that his scholarly reputation shielded his household under the German occupation, whereas the real reason, it turns out, is that his son was secretly collaborating with the Germans and was involved in crimes against humanity. So professor's blind neutrality then disappears as he discovers a stash of US dollars, jewelry, and gold melted from the fillings of victims of genocide. And these items are hidden in his house. And then at that point, his son is unmasked as a German collaborator. Cured of his ideological blindness, the professor is integrated into the collective, and as the town leadership embraces his long neglected plan to drain the swamps around the town and reclaim them for agriculture. But interestingly enough, this is really the story of unmasking also the story of unmasking the collaborator with the Nazis, the motif that becomes extremely prominent later on in the 60s in the Soviet film industry. Now, moving to the Latvian case, the Latvian film Victoria's Return is based on a play written by Vilis Lācis, a Latvian writer and the high party official. Lācis was a member of the communist underground between the wars and the interior minister during the first Soviet occupation. When the Germans invaded, he was the head of Soviet partisan.
I'm sorry, can you move to another slide?
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, of course, sorry, thanks for telling. And the play then, the play was transformed into a film script by Fyodor Knore, who also wrote the script for the Lithuanian film Marytė. And the film was directed by Viktor Ivanov, a Russian writer who just finished another war film for Lenfilm Studios, once again, based on the events of World War II, on the presentation of World War II in Latvia. And this film, made in 1946 and called Sons or Synovia, basically once again presents the split within the family, how one of the sons becomes the Nazi collaborator and another one becomes a pro-Soviet partisan, and that really the center of it is once again the question of collaboration and the split between the two brothers that we afterwards see once again in the 60s in Vytautas Žalakevičius's work and so forth. But in this particular film from 1947, really strikes much more optimistic chord by showing the majority of Latvians supporting the heroic figure of August Grieze, a local Soviet Latvian soldier who was falsely denounced by one of his Latvian compatriots as a Nazi collaborator, and how this August Grieze, the Soviet Latvian hero, regains the trust and recognition of the Soviet Latvian community through heroic deeds as an anti-Nazi partisan leader. So, but still, as I said, this motif of unmasking the collaborator, it's really it's similar with Estonian story, Estonian film script, film narrative. Now, Lithuanian case really is quite interesting. It differs quite sharply. First of all, because the main protagonist is a woman. It's a pro-Soviet, it's a Soviet Lithuanian partisan, Marytė Melnikaitė, who was a Komsomol member. Really, it's actually the copy of Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, a partisan who was captured and executed by German forces near Moscow in 1941 at the age of 18. So Marytė Melnikaitė is really a Lithuanian copy of Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya. Just tell very briefly, about her story. So it's a local Komsomol member from Zarasay who was evacuated, to the Russian interior when the Germans invaded in 1941, and then was later deployed back to Lithuania with a partisan unit captured and executed by shooting. And her story was really promoted as a Lithuanian icon, Stalinist Lithuanian partisan icon, really as I said, the version of Zoya narrative, but also the icon of pro-Soviet partisan movement. She was awarded, almost done, just a few points. So the most important point about the Lithuanian case is that is really not only the story of emancipation of this female pro-Soviet partisan hero, but also a nationalist and Soviet emancipation at the same time. At the center of this nationalist emancipation really is the question of Vilnius that figures prominently through this film. So it does not have any splits within the community, it does not have any collaboration motifs with the Nazis during Nazi occupation or so forth. It really represents the advancement of the national emancipation of the Lithuanian youth, the moving from the countryside to the city, and also shows a clear, basically, Polish, not only appropriation of the newly acquired capital, but also the resistance, not the resistance to basically there is this anti-Polish motif as well. And in the final scenes, we see then this Lithuanian pro-Soviet hero, in the background of this medieval castle, which is the symbol of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. So very different strategy. Now, just very quickly, a few sentences in conclusion. So as I said, each of these three films develop really like different custom-made strategy that presents a different story of World War II, and it, of course, integrates it in the plot of Soviet victory against the Germany with the accession of the Baltic states in the USSR, but still, as I said, really uses absolutely different storylines. And what is really interesting is precisely with this process of working with the local elites. In Lithuanian case, an entire group of people enters the cultural scene For example, Vytautas Žalakevičius, who becomes extremely prominent in 1965, Donatas Banionis, who later on becomes the Soviet kind of Lithuanian, super famous Soviet Lithuanian actor, and so forth. So the making of these films was part really, I believe, of a concerted effort to jumpstart the process of symbiotic cultural creation between the center and periphery of the newly expanded USSR, building on old and generating new patron-client relationships. So that's very briefly conclusions. Sorry if I went over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Violeta. Fascinating paper. Thank you so much. So that brings us to Alexandra. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Perfect. So thank you, Nick. Yeah. So this talk today, it's a part of my dissertation, which examines the creation of the institution of the political police in the Soviet republics, more specifically Belarusia, Estonia, Georgia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic from 1918 to the death of Stalin in March of 1953. And just as a point of clarification, I've chosen to use the term political police when I'm referring to the Soviet Union's state security and intelligence services, that is the Cheka in its various incarnations from the OGPU, NKVD, NKGB, MVD, MGB, and also the Robochaya Krestianskaya Militia, hereafter the Militia. I have selected the term political police over the perhaps more commonly used secret police because arguably the political police were not really a secret. The people whom the domestic security services policed knew who they were, and they also had a general understanding of the organization's mandate. So as I said, this talk is based on a chapter in my dissertation in which I examine the training of the political police officers, rank and file service members, as well as the militia men and women. I cover a lot of ground in this chapter, from examining the career tracks for service members within the schools, as well as specialized training and continuing education programs that existed for the service members, to admissions, curriculum, student examinations and evaluations, and as well as the day-to-day operations. Since I'm limited in time today, I've chosen to focus my comments on the attempts of the political police leadership in the republics to recruit and instruct local nationals at the training schools. The main argument I'm making today is that the political police leadership was acutely aware of the importance of hiring local nationals to serve in the political police, especially in these Western and Southern republics with their diverse and multilingual populations. This was not always the case, however, and they placed more emphasis on hiring and training locals following the Second World War and the strengthening of anti-Soviet nationalist groups. Before unpacking this argument and presenting my evidence, I would first like to give a brief overview of how the political police training schools functioned prior to 1940, to highlight the changes the leadership made to the schools during and after the Second World War. Following this overview, I would like to touch on the effect of the Second World War on the security environment in these republics so that we can better understand the threats facing the political police officers and service members and the steps they took to mitigate them. When Lenin created the Cheka in December 1917 to combat counter-revolutionary activity and sabotage, the first 40 employees of the organization had no formal training. These true revolutionaries had proven their aptitude for intelligence work and their loyalty to the Soviet regime throughout the course of the Russian Revolution and the following Civil War. The Russian Revolution and Civil War became the classrooms in which the new officers perfected their skills. However, when Lenin declared the conclusion of war communism in 1921, following what he saw as the end of the Civil War, Moscow had to devise new ways to systematically transform the young men of the Soviet Union into intelligence professionals. On April 21, 1921, the Moscow leadership opened the Central School of the Joint State Political Directorate, OGPU, which they designed to train the next generation of political police officers. The incorporation of Eastern Belarusia, the Caucasus, and Eastern Ukraine into the Soviet Union in 1922 increased the need for more trained security personnel. Throughout the late 1920s and 1930s, the Moscow leadership prioritized opening more political police training schools to combat what they saw as a growing threat from both enemies at home and abroad. In 1935, Moscow established NKVD interregional schools in 10 of the major urban centers of the Soviet Union: Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, Tbilisi, Tashkent, Alma-Ata, Rostov, Gorky, Sverdlovsk, and Novosibirsk. From 1935 to 1941, the 10 interregional schools trained approximately 2,000 student cadets every year, contributing greatly to the number of trained political police officers. These schools formalized and standardized the process by which a political police officer and militionär learned the skills of their profession and made it possible for Moscow to deploy an ordered and uniformed force across the Soviet territory. When the Red Army reclaimed the Western and Southern republics from the Axis powers in the summer of 1944, the Soviets faced new challenges posed by war-hardened nationalist groups located in those lands, which demanded an evaluation of pre-war and wartime training methods. In the Western and Southern republics, the situation was complicated by the presence of battle-hardened nationalist and anti-Soviet groups. The threat from both nationalist and anti-Soviet groups, which were present before the start of the war, had increased throughout the course of the war. In comparison to their pre-war predecessors, the nationalist and anti-Soviet groups after the war promised to be far more challenging to the Soviet regime as they adopted more sophisticated tactics from their own experiences in the Second World War and benefited from the profusion of weapons floating around the republics. The very existence of these groups and their determination to fight to the death threatened to undermine the carefully crafted narrative that the returning Soviets were liberators, not occupiers. Facing this new challenge, the Soviets were forced to reevaluate tried and true methods and to devise new strategies to overcome the nationalist and anti-Soviet groups. The political police leadership in the new Soviet territories quickly came to the realization that they would never be able to maintain control if they did not recruit the local population into the security services. Recruiting local nationals into the Soviet political police, a practice the leadership had previously avoided for certain nationalities, now seemed inevitable and served two purposes. First, it lent credibility to Moscow's narrative that the Soviets were not a neo-colonial force bent on conquering the local populations. By encouraging locals to join the service and police other locals, Moscow's claim that the Republican populations willingly joined the Soviet Union and were embracing Soviet institutions was supported. Second, the security services benefited from the local knowledge and access that native officers brought to the force. In a time when nationalist and anti-Soviet groups went underground, setting up camps in the forests of the republics and relying on the support from nearby villages, it paid to be able to think like these Soviet enemies and to know the local terrain. Moreover, officers from the same republic where they served found it much easier to connect with the village people because they spoke the local language and they had more success in persuading them to sever their ties with the illegal groups. As a former NKVD officer summarized, quote, "In our practical work, our organizations are connected daily to the broadest masses of the Lithuanian population, and this connection will be further improved when our organizations are adequately staffed with local people," end quote. The aim in the new territories was therefore to send as many qualified locals as possible to the political police training schools, and Moscow made the decision to open additional interregional schools in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldavia, and Western Ukraine to achieve this objective. These schools functioned exactly as the earlier interregional schools, but focused even more so on training local nationals for the security services. Finding local nationals who wanted to join the Soviet political police was more challenging than Moscow had anticipated, however. With the expansion of the Soviet Empire into the Baltics, Western Belarusia and Ukraine, Northern Bessarabia and Bukovina in 1940, Moscow had to reevaluate its entrance requirements for the political police training schools. As was the case in Azerbaijan and Georgia, the denizens of the territories incorporated in 1940 were also less likely to speak Russian than the populations of Eastern Belarusia and Ukraine, for example, which had been a basic entry requirement for the interregional schools prior to 1940. In addition, there were far fewer indigenous communists in the new territories than there were in the old Soviet republics. Therefore, the communist parties and the commissions who chose the students in the republics had to temper their expectations if they were going to meet the staffing demands of the security organs. 3 months after the Soviets invaded the Baltics, the Central Committee of the Lithuanian Communist Party, with Moscow's approval, decided that non-party members should also be considered for the NKVD schools, specifically because Moscow required them to recommend 200 Russian-speaking candidates in less than 1 month to attend the NKVD school. Between finding people who met all of the other qualifications and also spoke Russian, the Lithuanian Central Committee struggled to find suitable candidates regardless of party affiliation. This proved to be even more challenging after the Second World War, when, as one NKVD officer remarked, quote, "The recruitment of local nationals amidst the conditions of the active class struggle in the Republic and the Lithuanian nationalists' brutal terrorization of active Soviet Party members faces serious challenges," end quote. Despite periodically relaxing the qualifications necessary to attend a political police training school, the Republican leadership still found it difficult to recruit locals. This directly hindered the political police's capability to destroy the nationalist underground and anti-Soviet groups. In June of 1953, the chief of the Lithuanian NVD, Jonas Vidžiūnas, grimly spoke to his colleagues in Lithuanian about the challenges the political police faced in defeating the nationalist underground. The attempts to quash all resistance to Soviet rule was not new, and the political police had been trying to destroy these anti-Soviet groups and stymie their influence in the Soviet Union's western and southern borderlands from the moments the Soviet first stepped foot in these territories. Vidžiūnas conceded that the situation had not much improved, despite the Lithuanian political police's attempts to eradicate these nationalist groups for the past 13 years. He attributed the perpetuation of the problem to the fact that, quote, "The leadership of the MGB has for many years championed the wrong policy in relation to the national cadre. The total number of Lithuanian Chekists in the system of state security was very insignificant, and only a few have worked in leadership positions. The experienced Lithuanian Chekists were scattered, and the newly accepted personnel in the departments or those who have graduated from the operational schools were assigned to technical work or unimportant positions. As a result, the struggle aimed at the rapid elimination of the national underground and the authorities' attempt at close cooperation with the masses was complicated. This gave rise to nationalist agitation, which claimed that the Russians were occupying Lithuania." As a local officer, Vidžiūnas experienced firsthand how Soviet policies regarding the recruitment and placement of Lithuanians in the security service contributed to the widely held belief among the local population that the Soviets were an external foe bent on destroying not only the Lithuanian nation state, but also the Lithuanian people. Without more locals in the positions of power within the security services, the Soviets had no chance of wresting control of this narrative and reshaping it to alter the population's perception of Soviet rule in Lithuania. Vidžiūnas believed that not only by increasing the number of local nationals, but by also placing them in meaningful positions, the Lithuanian political police might have a chance to quash the anti-Soviet groups once and for all. The issue of too few local nationals in the security services was not unique to Lithuania and was endemic across the Western and Southern republics. In an order to the Latvian MVD, Beria echoed Vidžiūnas's observations and criticized how the Republican political police leadership carried out the training of employees for the Latvian MVD, which he considered to be, quote, "in gross violation of Leninist-Stalinist national politics," end quote. The head of the Latvian MVD acknowledged the validity of Beria's complaints in a report to the head of the Latvian Communist Party and remarked that, quote, "there has been no training of Latvian operational officers. And the result of this is that in the Latvian MVD, there are very few Latvians, which makes it difficult for the MVD and the militia to carry out the tasks assigned to us," end quote. The head of the Latvian MVD was not exaggerating, and the number of Latvians serving in the political police was dismal. In 1950, only 35.7% of the 714 recent MVD hires were Latvian, despite the political police leadership actively trying to augment the number of locals in the security service. The situation was even more bleak in the other republics. In the Moldavian SSR, only 9.2% of the MVD personnel and 8.4% of the MGB personnel were Moldavian in 1946. 1 year later, the Moldavian political police leadership set for itself the goal of changing the composition of the political police workforce so that more than 30% of the personnel identified as ethnic Moldavian. By early 1948, however, only 7% of the MVD officers and 4% of the MGB officers selected to serve in the nomenclatura identified as Moldavian. Thus, despite wanting to include more locals in both the Republican political police at large as well as the leadership, the Republican leaders struggled to significantly alter the composition of the security services. To conclude, the political police training schools played an essential role in creating the professional security services that the Moscow leadership used to control the Union's western and southern borderlands. Particularly after the Second World War, the Soviets believed that the recruitment of local nationals into the political police was essential to dispel the notion that the Soviets were foreign occupiers. By recruiting ethnic Estonians, Latvians, and Ukrainians, for example, into the security services and training them to police their own friends, neighbors, and family, the Soviets attempted to maintain the facade that large swaths of the population supported the Soviet government. Recruiting locals in the Western and Southern republics was easier said than done. The political police leadership was forced to adjust their expectation and reassess the school's admission policies to create the indigenous security service they envisioned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Very, very interesting. So we're right on schedule. So the panelists had it timed out perfectly. So we'll now give the floor to Dr. David Shearer, whom I introduced at the beginning of the session. We'll just repeat. He's the Thomas Munsey Keith Professor of History at the University of Delaware, and we're happy to have him as our distinguished discussant today. And the floor is yours, Dr. Shearer.
Let me turn my mute off. Okay, thank you, Nick. And my apologies for joining a little bit late. Of course, I had some trouble trying to get Zoom to work, but I think it finally happened. Okay, I don't want to take too much time away from the discussion, so I'll try to be brief in my comments. But I want to emphasize at least a couple aspects of these papers. One of which is that as I was reading through them, I was struck more and more by the sheer enormity and complexity of the task that faced the Soviet state in trying to pacify and Sovietize its newly annexed and occupied territories. This was not just to suppress armed resistance, which was difficult enough, not just to put in place new political and economic infrastructures and social institutions, but to reconstruct everything about daily life. And that's what these papers really emphasize, to reconstruct daily patterns of behavior, historical identity, and narratives of national memory. These papers especially highlight that last and most complex problem, these three papers. There's so much that's been written about resistance, or the armed resistance, these kinds of things, but these papers really focus on the task of reconstruction of daily life that the Soviets faced. Everything from police and repressive violence to techniques of cultural reconstruction. The second aspect that struck me were the several references to colonization in the papers. And of course, this is tied to the central theme of the panel, which is organized around resistance and the response to resistance by the Soviet regime. And that got me to thinking, seeing these references to colonization and also being aware of the organizing theme of the panel, it got me to thinking about these processes that these papers describe, whether they were in fact processes of colonization, that is to say, processes designed to respond to resistance, or whether we can see them within the context of processes of assimilation, national assimilation. Now, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the simple definition of colonization encompasses two basic aspects. Ethnically, it involves the action or process of settling among and establishing control over the indigenous people of an area. Geographically, it means the action of appropriating a place, a place or domain for one's use, that is the use of the colonizers. Soviet annexation of the new territory certainly fit both these criteria. And as I said, that also plays into the panel's theme, organized around the idea of resistance. But what struck me about these panel's papers, or this panel's papers, was also that Soviet colonization, if we want to use that term, or Sovietization, differed quite considerably from the classic 19th century kinds of colonization. And I wonder if colonization and resistance, certainly there was resistance, but if colonization is an appropriate term, or if we're talking about something like national assimilation. And in thinking about colonization, of course, I think about the classic examples of the 19th century. For one thing, in the case of the Baltics and in Moldavia, colonizing Soviets did not view the indigenous populations as inferior racially or ethnically, at least as far as I know. Maybe our panelists would disagree with that. As was true in most cases of 19th century colonization in South Asia or Africa. Also, people in the Baltic republics and in Moldavia were not colonial subjects, excluded from the legal, economic, social, and cultural life of their colonial masters. So one of the hallmarks of 19th century colonialism is exclusion and subjugation. In this case, in the case of the annexed territories, all of the people there were supposedly equal to and assimilated, or at least assimilatable, as Soviet citizens. All Soviet citizens with all of the rights that supposedly all Soviet citizens had. This is seems to be another really striking contrast to the idea of colonization. All three of these papers focus on the assimilationist, or as Violeta put it, the symbiotic relationship, rather than the exclusionary colonial aspects of Soviet politics, either through the cultural recreation of historical narratives in Violeta's paper, or the creation of indigenous police forces in Alexandra's paper, and even in Igor's paper. He traces an indirect kind of assimilation, I think. You frame this very clearly within the context of repression and resistance and repression, but it seems to me that it can also fit into the notion or the literature or the context of national assimilation. Igor notes that the food riots he studies occurred mainly in newly acquired areas, whereas Moldavian peasants in older Soviet territories tended not to engage in such riots, even though they were affected as much by shortages and hunger. Igor concludes that the food riots in the new areas arose out of pre-Soviet traditions, but that they gave way then, primarily through the use of repression, to a more Soviet approach, more Soviet behavior, meaning specifically the quiescence exhibited by peasants who had lived under the Soviets for many years and who understood the futility of open protest. That learning process, to me, even though it came through repression, was a process of assimilation, and it also applied to local officials, as well as to I'd say it applied to local officials, also new to Soviet ways, who sometimes sympathized with the protesters. And they too had to be taught proper Soviet behavior. It's as if in Igor's paper, all of these newcomers on both sides, whether they were officials or whether they were peasants, had to learn a new script of how to be Soviet, which means that in a sense then, and oddly, the food riots that you describe are not just a part of a tradition of resistance, but also became a mechanism of assimilation, both the resistance, the food riots, and the repression that came after. In her paper, in Violeta's paper, I think the assimilationist themes are much clearer. She traces a more cultural approach to assimilation, to recast the historical narrative of the populations of the newly occupied states through films, through movies. I thought that, Violeta, your comparison of plots was interesting, contrasting a meta story of national liberation in one case, as opposed to two movies that recreated social divisions through the lens of family conflict. As I read, though, I wondered whether these scripts were deliberately chosen, deliberately developed to fit the territory in which the movies were shown. Now, I know you talk about the strong amount of central control, but I wonder if we can go so far into that discussion as to talk about even micromanaging the plots that would be shown to which group of people. In other words, I guess what I'm asking is how much leeway did directors and scriptwriters have to develop the movie's storylines in each particular case? Or were the storylines also dictated to or chosen for them? So I also wanted to know some more about reception, if you can find that. I know you talked about rural versus urban showings, but it would be interesting to know more about where and how often they were shown, especially whether there's any information, any way to measure whether the movies were popular in the different republics, whether they were more popular there than in the old Soviet republics or other Soviet republics as well. In Alexandra's paper, first of all, I want to thank you for using and emphasizing the term political police. I'm commenting on a session tomorrow, and all three of the papers talk about secret police. and I think you're absolutely right, this is a misnomer. But Alexandra also highlights what we could call the assimilationist tendencies, or at least efforts, in her paper about police training in these new republics. Though I agree, it's maybe a little bit of a stretch to call Soviet motives here assimilationist, especially since they wanted local police recruits in order to better control local populations and legitimize Soviet rule. In reading your paper, though, two things struck me. Apart from what seems to me to be assimilationist, at least assimilationist motives on the part of Soviet leaders, I was surprised in your discussion about what I would consider the extent of training that you describe. Sounds a lot more rigorous to me than what I could see when I was looking at both the civil and political police in the 1930s. There are any number of documents, especially procuracy complaints and even Yagoda's own complaints about the lack of knowledge, about the lack of training of the political police, about their low educational levels, and even the boasting by many officers themselves that they had never read either the criminal code or the criminal procedure code. And so that was interesting, that was striking. The other thing that struck me about your paper was how closely intertwined the training of the two branches were, of the militia and the security officers, especially since in their duties and in their pay and in their status, they were very, very different. And so that was interesting. I knew that the civil police were subordinate to the security organs, but I wasn't aware of the extent to which they were also intertwined in training. In your paper, you also highlight the difficulties that Republic leaders faced in recruiting indigenous candidates, despite assimilationist goals. And that brings me back to this colonial comparison that I think is interesting. It made me wonder if it might be instructive to compare or contrast Soviet efforts to create local police cadres with, for example, British efforts to create an indigenous police forces in South Asia, in India in particular, in Pakistan, in the wake of the 1850s uprisings there. I think that would be a rich comparison because you're dealing with many of the same kind of issues, it seems to me, if you're going to be talking about colonialization. And so this colonial comparison brings me back to my main point, my final point, which is to challenge our panelists to think about their papers in categories other than resistance and colonization, if you will, but also contexts and literatures about national assimilation. And I wonder for each of you, if you might think about assimilation, national assimilation as useful categories or not useful categories, or something in between colonization and assimilation. So I'm right about 12 minutes, and I want to leave time for discussion, so let me stop there.
Sure, perfect. Thank you so much. So what I'll propose is that we react to the questions and comments in the order that we presented. So if you could start with Igor and then Violeta and then Alexandra, and in the remaining time, we'll address any questions that we have from the panel attendees. Feel free to post your questions in the chat, and we'll tackle those as time allows in the order that they're presented. But for now, let's start with Igor and your responses to David's questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you, David, very much for the comments. Actually, my aim in this paper was to focus only on resistance issue, because my broader project, as you know, is the famine. But you are right, and actually you had a premonition, and it's actually also it's an invitation to look at the famine issue from the lens of the national building process, which was used first by Terry Martin, very kind of tentatively, because it was, you know, late 90s, and more recently by Sarah Cameron. She also uses and she elaborates more on this issue, how the famine in Kazakhstan in the early 30s could be linked, could be you know, assimilated, could be put in this picture, bigger picture of nation building in Kazakhstan. And yes, and I have this in mind for this big project, and I'll try to do my best. For the moment, I don't know how it will, you know, go on that. It's very difficult. But yes, I'll definitely try to engage with your suggestions related to the concept that you are using, colonization versus assimilation. I would say, and you hinted to that, I would say there is something between these two concepts. I would say it's better to it's more proper, it's properly to use acculturation, because for instance, assimilation is a one-way process. Yes, you assimilate in British culture, you assimilate in English, Russian, whatever. Yes, acculturation means a two-way process. Yes, and you know, I'm a little bit familiar with this distinction because my PhD was Soviet nationality policy, and I think it's what happened really in the Soviet Union was acculturation, because you have a two-sided process. Yes, let me give more very shortly. What I mean by that, I mean that yes, the Russians influenced the local Moldavians. Yes, the way they are thinking, and so on and so on and so on. But also the Russians of Moldavia are different from Russians of Ukraine. So there is a kind of symbiosis, yes? And actually there is a book by Arutunian about these processes in the 70s. He's a sociologue. And he's giving such examples, for instance, of acculturation of both communities, yes? For instance, in the 70s in Soviet Moldavia, 40% of the Russians or Russian speakers favored Moldavian cuisine and Moldavian songs. Yes, so you have Moldavians, they were the main topics, you know, the novels, they preferred, you know, the novels about the war, or this kind of internationalist kind of. So you have, and then they preferred also Russian songs, kind of also even more, 50, 60%. So it's an interesting, suggestion. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I guess it's me now. Thank you very much for these reflections. They're really interesting and instructive. Now, regarding the micromanagement of these narratives, I think that national communists and the local cultural elites played an extremely important role here. Let's take a Lithuanian example. The plot that was written by Knorre, by a scriptwriter, was then adjusted by a local writer who was recruited by one of the members of Nomenclatura. Actually, that local writer, Augustinas Gricius, was a deportee. He was deported in 1941 and then released from deportation, and then by by one of the high level party members, like local Nomenclatura representatives, and then afterwards was recruited to adjust the script. So in other words, although it was definitely propaganda, you know, Lithuania was portrayed as this partisan republic, kind of modeled after Belarus, and that lasted, you know, for the in different forms for the entire Soviet period, with Marita Melnikaite being only the Stalinist icon. Afterwards, we have, you know, Lithuania has other icons, but definitely this attempt to really adjust it to the local narratives that mobilized, that moved the emotions during the interwar period, this absolutely came from the local cultural elites. And first of all, Writers' Union, the entire idea to create more female heroes, more female partisan heroes or other kinds of heroes. This came from Justas Paleckis. And when one looks at the stenograms, the Writers' Union right after the war, one sees these ideas being formed right there. So in other words, there's a lot of power, interpretative power, coming from the republics themselves. Now, regarding the reception of these films, the Estonian film was showed in the other republics. A Lithuanian film, you know, Marita, I don't have any information that it was shown elsewhere. In general, I have to say the reception is a tricky thing to research, and I really need to do much more work here. I cannot competently answer what the reception really was. So, but the production, and as I said, the networks that were formed, this, the relationships, these are certainly, to my mind, as significant than as the reception. But as I said, I do not really know what the reception was. There are, you know, reviews, and there was certainly not very popular, these films, but I cannot, I cannot say more than that. Now, regarding colonization, I actually agree with Igor, and I will not take more space. I also would use this term acculturation. I think it's a good approach, because it's a, you know, it shows that kind of the two sides, you know, this the two sides to the process. So far, I mean, so much for now. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, no, these are fantastic points, and you've given me a lot of excellent food for thought, David. I would say that I think I differ slightly from Violeta and Igor with the question of, like, is assimilation a good term? I think that after the Second War, especially, assimilation is much more the goal. And I would argue that that's the case when it comes to the political police, particularly because of the way that the training is taking place. The goal ultimately, at least from my perspective, is to have a standardized training so that the officers and the rank and file service members could ultimately police in, say, their own republic, but then could also be sent to, say, Estonia if there was an election coming up and they needed extra help, or to be sent to Georgia because they had this particular training and they have the specialty of using dogs, and now they can go and support there. So there really is this idea that they're creating an all-union force. And yes, they want people who understand local language and the terrain, et cetera, and the local population, but at the same time, they're creating something bigger than that. So I think assimilation is a really good way to think about it, especially after the Second World War. I think before it's a little more complicated because, as I mentioned, there were some nationalities that were excluded from being in the political police. For example, Ukrainians and Belarusians in the 20s and the early 30s were not allowed to attend any of the training schools. And so some people get in certain ways, but there's actually orders that go out that are excluding these people. So that begs the question sort of why. And I do want to say that just to speak briefly about the sort of the aspiration of, yes, they want them to be this professional force and they have this idea that they're going to be doing all of this, very sophisticated intelligence collection and policing. The reality, of course, is always vastly different on the ground. So many people are supposed to be literate and they come in and then they're not literate at all and they have to do remedial reading and they can't add and they can't do whatever. So there's this constant push and pull between what the political police leadership wants the force to look like versus what they're getting from the candidates, and then how they're trying to pull the candidates up to the level that they want. And I actually have an entire chapter of the dissertation that I call Policing the Political Police. And it's about correcting behavioral issues and also trying to bring up education levels, et cetera. So that's definitely, this is all aspirational. I think the documents show that the reality is vastly different on the ground.
So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity to read that soon, right, Alexandra? So Alexandra, I want to give you a little bit of a respite because there's a couple of questions in the chat for you, and you just finished up responding to the discussant. So if you could maybe take a glance at those, and if you're inclined to address those, you'll have a few minutes to do that. Maybe we turn our attention to Igor for a second. The last question in the chat was regarding or second to last question, regarding inter-ethnic relations within the grassroots villagers' protests. If you're able to comment on that, Igor.
Yeah, I've seen it. Yeah, David's question, I have seen it. Thanks, Nicholas. And there is another one by Grant Harvard. I will try very briefly because we don't have too much time. Related to the inter-ethnic relations, yes, during the protests, the food riots. This is the question by David Carnevale. Actually, these riots happened on the village level. Yes, we have only in 2 cases we have several villages participating in one food riot. Yeah, it's like gathering together from several villages, several hundred people, and going to the closest storehouse, grain storehouse. Yes, this happened in Chimishlia, for instance. Yes, and it's on the map here. I have 4 or 5 villages. We don't have, and all these villages are Romanian-speaking villages. So we don't have other cases when one village is Bulgarian or Gagauz and another one is Moldavian. We don't have this kind of collaboration or competition, whatever. But related, the question is good because there is a lot of, and I want to cover that, inter-ethnic relations during the famine as a whole, yes? This is just the beginning. The food riots is just the beginning of the famine. But there are data I have from the archives about the inter-ethnic relations during the famine, and there are some sensible issues. For instance, the representation of ethnic groups in the cannibalism statistics. Yes, who are the perpetrators and also stuff. So there you have, in these cannibalism cases, for instance, you have various ethnicities, and this reflects actually the composition, ethnic composition of the countryside, because basically the famine was felt mainly in the countrysides. So you have the perpetrators or victims in the cannibalism. You have Moldavians, Romanians, whatever. You have Bulgarians. You have a lot of Gagauzis, because actually the epicenter is in Gagauzia of today. You have Bulgarians. You have Gypsies. You don't have Russians. You don't have Jews. And this is because, and this is an invitation to look closer to the, and I think there is a divide, urban-rural divide here, yes? Interactive relations, there are some conflicts. For instance, Bulgarians from the southern part, they say to a neighboring village of Moldavians, says, we are fed up with feeding the Moldavians. Yes, they are lazy. So things that you find in the official discourse as well, you know, related to the famine, and you have that in Holodomor, and you have here as well, you know, the official saying, actually you are lazy, you know, they are blaming the. And here you have this difference, because Bulgarians and Gagauzis were colonists in the 19th century. They came here, and they usually were richer than the Moldavians, because as colonists they received more land. So there are tensions, and in the peacetime, in good times as well, but in the famine years, the tensions are going up, of course. I think I should stop here. Grant, yeah, if you are hearing me, I'll answer to you in private, because I'm afraid we don't have time to.
Yeah, maybe if Alexandra is inclined to answer either of the questions posed to her, maybe we'll just give a minute for that, and then we'll have to wrap things up and bid farewell to everyone.
So I'm going to try to answer both Malcolm and Grant's questions as quickly and concisely as possible. So I think that Malcolm, with regard to consistencies, 100%. The political police officers, et cetera, the rank and file, when they went to these training schools, they learned how to report. And so the reports are standardized across the republics, which is really frustrating because it doesn't really give you much texture to the local challenges. They'll include quotes, et cetera. But I think that consistency is definitely there. And moreover, the leadership, especially, you know, in, I would say the 20s through the 40s, depending on the republic, a lot of the leaders are actually from Russia, within the leadership within the political police, and they've operated in other republics, and now they're coming, say, to help in Estonia or help in Lithuania. And so they also have a way of doing business. And so I think that those consistencies exist and continue. Where you can see some of the difference, of course, is in the statistics, right? So the nationalist underground, I would argue it's a much bigger problem in Ukraine and Lithuania than, say, in Estonia. And so that means that there's more of the reporting is focused on dealing with that in Estonia or Lithuania and Ukraine, excuse me, and less so in Estonia, and they're focusing on different things. So that's sort of more of where you can see some nuance, and then of course, other things. And then very quickly, Grant. So interestingly, there's never a goal for recruiting Jews into the political police, absolutely for what they consider like an Estonian or a Latvian. So I think there obviously are Jews within the political police. I saw their personnel files, but it's not a goal to recruit them. So I think you might be onto something about what are the optics perhaps of trying to avoid having a bunch of Jewish people in the political police. So.
All right, well, thank you so much, Alexandra. So I'd like to thank all of the panelists and the discussant, you know, very rich material here. It was just a pleasure to be able to chair the panel. Hopefully we can continue the discussions outside the panel at the, you know, the water cooler or whatnot. So thank you everyone so much for coming, and have a wonderful weekend, and good health to everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.